Great. Hi, I am not Jerry Barker, but this still is the panel on capitalism. Jerry couldn't make it, so I am substituting at the last minute, and I apologize to you all. I feel like you've gone to the ballet, but the real ballerina is not showing today. But I'll do my best here. First, let me introduce the panelists who've changed also. At least one of them has. To my far right, though probably not really politically, is Tyler Cowen. Tyler is a professor of economics at George Mason University and the director of the university's Mercatus Center. His latest book is Average is Over, Powering America out of the Great Stagnation, which focuses on the implications of inequality. You may know him best, and you probably do know him, as the co-writer of a blog called Marginal Revolution, which I commend to you because Tyler thinks differently than all the rest of us, and it's neat to find out. Second is Diana Farrell. Diana Farrell is the president and CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase Institute, and in there is the violation of all the rules of punctuation, but it is one word, apparently. Anyway, the J.P. Morgan Chase Institute is the bank's think tank. Is that fair? Fair, OK. From 2009 to 2011, Diana served in the White House as Deputy Director of the National Economic Council and Deputy Assistant to the President on Economic Policy. And prior to that, she headed the McKinsey Global Institute, which was McKinsey's think tank. I feel I see a pattern here, but perhaps we'll find out what's coming next. Now, to my left, could have been Jason Furman, who is the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. But he was unavoidably detained also. I don't think he's out there with Jerry Baker somewhere. In any case, this is as close as we could get to almost the identical person, because this is Alan Krueger, who preceded Jason as the chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. He is now a professor of economics at Princeton. I guess that's what I'll have to say about him. He's got a lot of views about things that are highly controversial, and maybe we'll be hearing about some of them. And then, hardly least, but last, is John Taylor. John Taylor is a professor of economics at Stanford and a senior fellow in economics at the Hoover Institution. He has considerable experience in Washington. Among other positions, he was a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, another theme here today. And he was Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs in the second Bush administration. It was the second Bush administration. First?
First of George W.
Oh, OK. I stand corrected. His latest book is First Principles, 5 Keys to Restoring America's Prosperity, which won the 2012 Hayek Prize. OK. Now, I'm going to start with this by entertaining a point of order from one of our panelists. The title of this panel confused some of us, and she would like to talk about a little bit, before we go any further, about what she means by capitalism, which is what we're going to be talking about. Is that fair, Diana?
Sure. Well, let me start with some of you may have seen a recent survey reported by the Washington Post on millennials. The majority of millennials do not believe in capitalism. That was the headline. And my observation was, do millennials even know what capitalism is? And then I thought, does anybody know what capitalism is? And I would argue that we don't have a working definition and shouldn't have a working definition of capitalism that is functional, because at the end of the day, what we're really trying to do is construct a society that has very clear rules of when markets are levers to achieve an outcome. And some of you are familiar with Michael Sandel's work of, the danger that we have to a large degree is that we go from a society that uses markets to achieve certain goals to a market society where everything's for sale. And so in that sense, you'd say we've gone too far with capitalism for that reason. But it's also who establishes the rules of the game and how do they get established, through what process. And no definition of capitalism could give you a single answer on all of those. So I think that the real question that we would want to channel is, what are the instruments of, what are the tools that capitalist societies have developed, i.e. the use of markets, i.e. the use of regulation, i.e. the use of political systems, and which of those need tweaking, improving, changing, revolutionizing, because I don't think that you could have any definition of capitalism that would encompass every variation on any of those three.
Fair enough. Let me spout off for just a minute, and then I will push the panelists to start talking about. Whatever you think capitalism is, it's been showing its rough edges for the last 3 or 4 decades. Wage growth is stalled, which I think you all know, and probably as important, which you may not all know, when you think about it, it's true, workers are increasingly at risk of the vicissitudes of the marketplace in terms of unemployment, in terms of health benefits, in terms of survival in old age. Employers have no longer routinely supply health insurance. They no longer routinely supply defined benefit plans, and just try to figure out what the average American knows about their retirement plan, and you'll be shocked. And many workers find themselves now expect a lifetime of scrambling from job to job, the so-called gig economy, and it probably is coming. That's certainly one thing that has annoyed people about capitalism. A second is the fact that the event that everybody said couldn't happen again happened in 2008. And we don't need to talk about that much, but there's no doubt that it revealed a fragility of some bedrock institutions, ranging from banking regulation to common currency in Europe to the gigantic, never-fail American mortgage insurance agencies. Third, and here there's less evidence, there is a sense that the rules of the game are no longer fair, that increasing concentration in business has allowed businesses to exert market power where they shouldn't, that the protection of IP favors some over others, that tax breaks that proliferate in the tax code, apart from being unfair, are also straining government budgets and increasingly putting at risk what we've got left for old people in terms of pensions and medical care. Now, how much you buy those is your job. But I think what we want to do at this point is start asking some questions about what I would call the three big weaknesses of sort of capitalism. One is relying on markets to determine the distribution of income and wealth in an era of declining responsibility on the part of the wealthy and the powerful. Let's see, first of all, whether or not we all agree that income distribution driven by markets is a problem. Alan.
I think it's become a problem. About 10 years ago, I had a debate with Jim Heckman where my contribution was called Inequality, Too Much of a Good Thing. And one of my concerns is that we are in an inequality trap where the bottom extends all the way up, probably the 50th, 60th, 70th percentile, has done much worse than the top. And that's affecting opportunities for children born to low-income families. So we see the gap in school quality expanding. We see the gap in extracurricular activities that children do expanding. And that's going to lead to less social mobility down the road. And I think that that's a serious problem, not just for those in the bottom, because obviously for them it's a problem, but for our economy overall, because we're losing talent. We're not developing our talent to its fullest. Raj Chetty has new research showing that very talented children born in the bottom 80%, are much less likely to have patents and make discoveries compared to children born in the top 20% with the same math ability and so on. And that's not good for our country because it means that we're not going to make the fundamental discoveries that are necessary to propel economic growth in the future. And of course, this brings a lot of political problems, which I think can down the road jeopardize the stability of the type of country that we've grown accustomed to.
So in a way, this is an interesting argument. We tend to think of income inequality as the fact that I've got less than you or you've got less than me, and that maybe what's driving this is a system in which income is distributed through wages. But I think Alan's making a different point here, which is that the static notion of income inequality is less important, and the more ominous fact is that the people at the bottom end, their children will do worse than they are doing too. That it's also undermining social mobility. Anybody else want to talk about this?
I don't yet see a crisis. Alan mentioned the work of Chetty, but Chetty shows income mobility has not gone down. We'd certainly prefer if it went up. And if we think about inequality, the question is, what's the inequality that matters? And I would say that's the inequality of some notion of happiness or well-being. It's very hard to measure. There are even some good papers suggesting that inequality has gone down. I would sooner say we don't know. But to go back to capitalism, is there more capitalism in the world today than ever before? Yes. And if you ask the simple question, if you had to pick the America in which year and be given its problems to solve, I actually honestly believe you would still pick 2016 of all years in our history. I mean, overall, just things are never that great. But I'd rather have today's problems than, say, the problems of even the 1980s.
And it's including its economic problems.
I think some of the economic problems, which are mostly about stagnation of the middle, come from a very strange 20-year period where China has been rising, had a much bigger economic footprint than we thought. That time is over. We'll see what happens next. But I don't think the next 20 years are going to look like the last 20.
Okay. But guys, is this a problem? Do we need to do anything about this? Does capitalism, this is the first bit, does capitalism need saving? I mean, do we need to do something? And if so, what? Diana?
Well, I would sort of say, I think Alan was referring to something very important, which is there are different kinds of inequalities. So when we see the kind of inequality that transpired in the last 20 years in China, for example, which was everybody was poor, but then some people started urbanizing and gaining wealth, and you saw very high degrees of inequality there through that process, and still now. But it was a mechanism that then brought people into middle income, that made them consumers, that actually drives a positive process in an economy. So I don't think that we can say inequality necessarily is bad. Sometimes inequality is a transition process for going. I think the danger that we have in the US as opposed to the world, because in the world I think we've actually had a lot less inequality. We've had enormous poverty alleviation. We've had all sorts of things, is what you were referring to, Alan, which is to the extent to which the inequality begins to undermine the processes that generate prosperity, that generate happiness, et cetera. And I do think that we have something to be concerned about. I think that we see an undermining, a disenfranchisement of people, left and right. We see public goods, education, healthcare, et cetera, bifurcating between the very best, which is what wealthy people get, and what's available to everybody else. And I don't know that inequality necessarily is a bad thing. Sometimes that's a transition to a system that's working better. But when inequality undermines the very system itself, I think we have a problem, and I think there are reasons to be concerned right now.
John, I think you wanted. I know you want to talk a bit about.
Absolutely.
Essentially about what you see here and what you want to do about it.
Well, first of all, in capitalism very much depends on the place it's working. The government policies are there. You can squash capitalism if you want to with government. Look at the early days of China, Soviet Union. So when you say capitalism working or not, it seems to me it's the environment, it's the government policy. I mean, I like to emphasize you have to have sort of policies of economic freedom, rule of law, predictable policy, emphasis on markets, emphasis on incentives, and a limited role of government. And if you do all those things right, it takes off, and you get a lot of the good things, including a more equal opportunity set up. In the 15 years you're referring to, 1 billion people have been removed from poverty around the world. 1 billion people. That's what the World Bank says. So and that's capitalism. That's growth. That's China. It's sub-Saharan Africa. It's a terrific story. But now I think we're being complacent, and government policy is frequently getting in the way of those powerful things. And with respect to what we could do here, I look at the dismal inequality in what we're doing to provide education to young kids in this country. This is serious. There's a study just completed at Stanford, where I work. Huge disparity of the quality of education in this country by geographic area. The poor inner cities, you know how terrible it is. Terrible. The first thing I would do, if I could somehow convince people, and there's a lot of people who agree, is fix that problem. That affects a huge number of people, individuals. Chetty's work shows a correlation about upward mobility. When you come to what policy you do, his first thing is education, because we know where the direction of causality works there. So I think.
But let me press you on this, because I know in general your politics doesn't run towards government spending, toward having the government spend more. What would you do about this?
Well, you know, this same study tries to correlate spending per pupil. Found no correlation in the quality of the performance. There's lots of reasons for that. It's tough to provide education in Center City, to be sure, and maybe there's more security issues. But that's what the data shows. There's something else. My colleague Rick Hanashek says the quality of the teachers. And if we could do something with providing more incentives, I'm serious. You know, if you get back, and we live in a state where the scores for 8th grade Hispanics in math are next to last in the country. Another state, which borders on Mexico, Texas, is second. So there's something there. There is data there that makes, what are they doing? Is it coincidence? I don't think so. I think there's something there.
Alan, I know you've got something to say on this.
First of all, I interpreted the question about capitalism in the U.S. and our mixed system, our mixed economy. What John said is certainly right, that we should all celebrate the progress that the world has made. When it comes to the U.S., however, I think we need to change our education system to make sure we have a more level playing field. When you mentioned, Peter, that a lot of people feel that the rules are rigged, they're rigged right from the start with the enormous gaps we have in the quality of education. Detroit can't even pay its teachers through the rest of the school year at the moment. The lowest hanging fruit is preschool education. Yet we haven't figured out how to pay for it. I think school resources do matter. I think the gross question about spending creates a lot of statistical problems. For example, we do have compensatory spending in a number of states, so the weaker students get more spending. When actual randomized experiments were done, like in Tennessee, where grade school students were put in smaller classes, they benefited from the smaller classes compared to the control group. And that's the most expensive component, is having more teachers per child. And of course, if we want to get better teachers, we need to pay them more. But that's a very long-run solution. I think it has to be part of the solution, but I think we need to do more. We need to work on the rules, which when I first met Deanna Farrell, we were working on Dodd-Frank, which I think will lead to a set of rules, some of the rulemaking still going on, which has led to a more stable financial sector. But I think we need to do quite a bit more, more than just on education, even though I'm as supportive as education as about anyone you'll find.
Okay, but we can move on, but I'm just struck by the fact, and maybe you are too, that this line about education has been going on forever. I mean, you could have come to this conference 10 years ago and you would have heard the same story about how important education is, how important early childhood education is, and how we got to fight against social immobility with this. And we're not getting anywhere, are we, folks? It doesn't appear we're getting anywhere.
So Peter, I will say the following. Sorry, I would say the following to this, which is, of course, I believe in education. Nobody wants to be against education. I worry that part of what's happened in our country is our focus on education and our acceptance of how important it is has actually exacerbated the problem, because it means that people with means are tripling and quadrupling on education and tutoring their children and sending them to schools and doing all kinds of things around what is the public system and creating a bigger and bigger gap. And I do think there's a parallel with healthcare, which is that if we to the extent that we have sort of a runaway top that gets to super invest in something, we're just going to continue having a big delta between what that top is doing and what a public system can reasonably do, even if we could fix it, which it's far from being fixed. So I wouldn't want to say, if we want to improve our system, and I would just have to say that's the attitude, a more perfect union. We don't have answers. Capitalism has solved many, many problems, but it's creating new problems. So now we have to turn attention to what are the new problems and educate. We cannot rely on a 20-year process of education to get us there. So what can we rely on? I think I start with the notion that what capitalism is supposed to do is deliver productivity, efficiency gains, and then distribute those efficiency gains, that surplus, to workers and to shareholders and to consumers. And as we think about the various processes through which that happens, that's where our solution space lies. So what are the things that we're going to do to address the productivity question? You know, some of you who have seen these statistics would be alarmed by the slowdown that is now maybe a 15-year phenomenon in productivity. Maybe we're not measuring it right, but even if it's half true, we have a problem in terms of driving real productivity gains that are going to be the basis on which anybody gets to participate in prosperity. So I think there are a whole set of things we can think about there, which are macro types of policies and, very importantly, sector-level policies, regulations that really underpin the innovation and the competitiveness of individual sectors. That's one area. And then we have the distributional issues, which include everything from our labor laws to our compensation and tax policies to our safety nets and social systems, and of which education is one. But I think we would make a big mistake to say, let's hang it all on the hat of an education process that, even if we were wildly successful, would take 20 years to resolve. I think we can do many other things, and we could talk about any of the ones I mentioned.
So I'm going to press this quite specifically, but I think Tyler's been itching over there.
I think we are getting somewhere on education. It's a bipartisan issue. There's much more experimentation now than there had been 20 or 30 years ago. There's much more philanthropic interest. Test scores for the nation as a whole are actually up slightly, and that's in a time when more immigrants have been processed. So I don't see huge gains, but in terms of shifting the focus on the issue and having put the pieces in place for it to be much better 20 years from now, I think we're absolutely there. But on the core question, does capitalism need saving? I would focus most of all on the issue of ideas. Do people in this country still believe in capitalism? And I know that if you listen to Bernie Sanders or look at some polls, a lot of young people have more sympathy for what they call socialism than ever before. But I don't think they mean real socialism. If you ask Americans questions such as, do you support trade? The answers are more positive today than they were 5 years ago. If you look at views on immigration, the two parties diverged in 2006. That, in my view, is a bad thing. But Americans actually are more pro-immigrant as they are polled than they used to be. So if you look at a lot of basic issues of tolerance, belief in the system, people accepting consumerism, heralding innovation, I think mostly people here believe in capitalism. There's not a coherent intellectual alternative. And the candidacy of you-know-who, I think, is a sign of that. He's the big opponent of the status quo, Donald Trump. But when you look at what ideas are actually there, it's mostly about his personality.
Guys, I'm struck by the fact that the ideology of the folks across this it varies quite a bit. But nobody here seems to want to particularly talk about the straightforward income redistribution. It may be because some of these folks have been in politics and it doesn't hang very well, but we do have a whole bunch of mechanisms for making poor people less poor right now, next month. And I do want to raise the issue, there's one giant, what is now called a conservative way of redistributing income, which is called the universal basic income, in which everybody gets a check. All of you get checks. Everybody gets a check. Most other social services are withdrawn. You pay for your own life, but you get enough so that if you can't get a job, you can do okay. Now, that's gaining traction, and I'm curious to, as a means of dealing with this most immediate problem of the fact that that the lower middle class is falling apart, or could be falling apart. And I'm curious what the panelists think about this idea, the universal basic income.
Do you want to take this on?
Who wants to start with this?
So let me just, if I may go back to what I said before, because I do think there's a problem of inequality of opportunity, I would call it. And if I'm going to try to level the playing field, I want to bring those people up who are suffering. And that seems to me the thing. We do have a safety net. You maybe want to make it more generous, but to me, that's not going to solve the problem. What's going to solve the problem is opportunity and growth and people advancing and the whole economy growing. And so that's why I focus on education to begin with, but there's a whole wide range of things. Productivity growth is how people get more income over time. You have to have a system which is inclusive and makes sure everybody can join in that opportunity. But if you look at sort of the last 50 years, we had terrible productivity growth in the 70s. It picked up in the 80s and 90s, and now it's dismal again. There's this gigantic productivity cycle. So it's not all over. We can get back. We can improve, but it requires a change in policy. The policy in the 70s was terrible. 80s and 90s, much better. Recently, I think it's terrible. And it corresponds quite closely with these movements in productivity. So to me, I can give a list of broad, narrow things. Education is one of them because you're focusing on inequality. But there's also this regulation issues, there's financial market issues, a whole wide range of things that you'd want to have put together. It's hard to do, that's for sure.
John, I do want to get to those actually because it's my fault, but we're going to run out of time before we run out of things to say. I do want some responses, though. To any of you feel at this point that we as a society should be making a much greater effort to redistribute income, period. That is using tax dollars to give some people a lot more money.
Well, I mentioned a whole suite of things one could look at, of which tax policy is an important one. And I think the two things that are being hotly debated right now, because we are in a tenuous situation, are minimum wage proposals, expansion of the earned income tax credit, and these merit a lot of attention, in my view. So the minimum wage issue gets shorthanded to let's have a federal minimum wage that is, multiples of about the median of, certain states. That probably makes less sense than saying, locality by locality, do we get a floor whereby the things you worry about when you raise the price of labor, i.e. that there's no demand for labor, get offset by the fact that you're paying people more, and therefore they're contributing to demand in the economy. This is the famous Ford, I got to pay my workers so that they will buy cars dimension. And I think what we're learning is if you time it correctly to the market, if you place it at the right level, you might actually do better than just having too low a floor or too high a floor where when the dynamics of demand for labor would kick in enormously. I think a lot of economists are thinking hard about that problem. Some cities are experimenting with that, and that's probably a good thing. We have a lot to learn there. I think the orthodoxies that said any minimum wage is terrible have shown to be wrong, and I think there's an opportunity to do more, but we probably could do too much if we're not careful. Same thing with the earned income tax credit. It's been a very successful program in many ways. I'm not sure that all the people who qualify for it are taking advantage of it. I'm not sure that it extends as much as it should. There are penalties associated with certain aspects that probably don't make sense. A whole good area where we could make a lot of progress. And there's a discussion as to whether we should have minimum wage or earned income tax credit. I think most economists would say there's probably some distortion that these levers introduce. So having a balance of both is probably a good thing. And I sort of commend those states and those municipalities that are really contemplating this, because just going to the orthodoxies is not an answer. So yes, I think that some people are promoting it, and I think it's a good idea. Devil's in the details, and that's what we need to spend our time on, depoliticize the issue and get much more tactical about how one would implement these things.
Charlie, you had something to say here.
I would at the margin offer more cash assistance, but I'm much more skeptical about the universal basic income idea than I used to be. And a lot of it is political economy. For instance, one thing I think it would mean is in the long run, we take in many fewer immigrants. People don't like the idea of immigrants coming to a country and just getting cash. I do understand that's the wrong way to frame it, but I believe that's how it would be framed. I think also the idea of taking away health benefits and giving people the cash, it makes perfect economic sense, but as an issue of time consistency, if people don't buy insurance for whatever reason, are we willing to just let them die? We wouldn't, and I feel it would unravel. That I don't think the healthcare benefit you can give people cash for instead, for the most part, maybe a bit at the margin. And finally, this is the same kind of issue that came up when we faced the prospect of mortgage cramdown, which might have made sense in 2009. But Americans hate the idea that the next door neighbor gets something they don't when the next door neighbor behaved less responsibly. And again, that might be irrational, but I don't think it's going away. And I think all that put together probably means the universal basic income is essentially off the table. It may work in small Nordic countries where there's more social consensus, but I don't think it will here.
Okay. Alan, I know you wanted to say something, and then we're going to move on.
The idea of a universal basic income is not brand new. Humphrey was for immigrants. We have had experiments like the Manitoba negative income tax experiment. And it's intriguing to me that it's kind of made a comeback now, even though the politics, as Tyler pointed out, are not what's driving the interest. I think as an animating principle, it makes a tremendous amount of sense. And at some level, we do have a basic minimum income for people who work. And our safety net has moved over the last 25, 30 years towards supporting work, less so for those who don't work. And the downside, of course, of having a very strict minimum income, which you then tax away, is that it could potentially affect labor supply. But I think thinking about the suite of policies that we pursue and saying that people should have a minimum living standard in the U.S., it's not appropriate for people to be dying on the streets. That's part of the motivation for the Affordable Care Act. I think that's a very sound principle. Although even on the economics, and here I'm on a limb since Milton Friedman and James Tobin both agreed on negative income tax, I think in principle you want to use a lot of instruments because they have their own distortions. And if you use multiple instruments, you can help offset some of the others, which is why we've moved towards combining the minimum wage with the EITC, as Deanna mentioned.
Gotcha. Actually, minimum, we don't have an obligation to talk anything in particular. I keep hearing minimum wage, minimum wage. Does anybody here feel that a substantial increase in the minimum wage would be a bad idea at this point?
Yes.
Good,
Yes.
good. I'm going to hear,
Alan, too.
this.
Depends how you define substantial.
I teach freshmen supply and demand, supply and demand for labor. It
But-
depends on the elasticities. And you have empirical work by Alan and others. But ultimately, it's going to cost some jobs. Some people who are lucky to keep their jobs and get a higher income. You can make it miserable for people who lose their jobs. Frequently, they're the people you care most about, I care most about. You're helping people who are part of families who are not, it's not targeted very well. I'll give you Peter used to work for the New York Times.
Pardon?
You used to work for the New York Times.
Yes.
I'm going to give you an amazing story. Maybe you worked for them in 1987. I don't remember. Did you? Mm-hmm. Okay. In 1987, the New York Times wrote an editorial. Maybe you wrote it. It was headlined, Optimum Minimum Wage, 0.00. 1987.
Well, I
and
did
the
write
argument was it was not targeted. And you had other things, the things that Diana and Alan just referred to. So times have changed, and I think for the worse in that respect.
Peter,
Alan, I'm sorry. I'm going to defer to Alan at this point because Alan has done much of the seminal research, which has changed a lot of thinking about the minimum wage. Why don't you talk about what you think at this point the optimal minimum wage would be?
Well, first of all, the New York Times changed its position, in part, I think, because it learned from the research. And there was a wave of research in the late 80s, early 90s, which challenged the conventional supply and demand model that John has in his textbook, and moved more in the direction of labor markets not perfectly competitive. Companies have some market power. Companies have some independence in setting the wage. They're not just following the market. They're not just wage takers. which John also discusses in his textbook. So I think our view of the way the labor market operates has changed. That said, at a certain point, you do get back on the demand curve and you do start to see the loss in jobs that John referred to. My research, that research of others, and actually a large majority of the studies since the late 80s has found that moderate increases in the minimum wage, moderate levels of the minimum wage don't have a detectable effect on employment and do raise wages considerably for low-wage workers. The experience in the US and around the world makes me feel comfortable that a national minimum wage, which is now at $7.25 an hour, if that were moved up to $10, $11, $12 an hour, which is in the range of where it was historically. Minimum wage now in real terms is well below where it was in the 1960s. The decline in the real value of the minimum wage is a major factor in the rise in inequality that we've seen in the US. So I think a moderate increase would have a beneficial effect. I'm very concerned about a federal minimum wage at $15 an hour, which has been the New York Times position recently. I think that goes too far. So I think we need to have balance at the national level. And I think it's positive for the states to explore different levels depending upon the makeup of their labor markets, their industries, wage levels in those states. And I think it's also helpful that some states like California have an off-ramp where the governor can slow or stop the increase if he feels or she feels it's in the interest of the state.
So
Diane.
well said, and I agree with that. Maybe I'd move us to one other consideration. I think if we were answering the question of does capitalism need saving purely on what we're doing with that sort of end of the labor market, we wouldn't be doing it justice. So I'd like to introduce one other very important dynamic, which I think is to the extent that there's been an erosion to support for capitalism, if you like, it's sort of the experience that we, through some of the research we're doing, are documenting, which is it's not just low-income people, it's first, second, third, fourth, and fifth quintile people, although we don't worry so much about them and shouldn't because they're well provisioned for, that are experiencing, as a matter of their day-to-day lives, very high levels of income and consumption volatility. And this is really important because if we were solving only for the low income folks, I think we have a suite of issues that we might tool on, but I think we have to deal with that, and we have to deal with a phenomenon that I think is corroding a sense of people's stability. If you poll people, what do you prefer? Would you rather have stability, or would you have growth in your income? Huge majorities will say stability. And what do we find when we do sort of transactional level understanding of what the individual and family's financial lives are like? We find extremely high levels of income volatility. Within labor income alone, 55% of people will experience a 30% swing in their income month to month. Well, you know, that's an extraordinary thing. We also know that the only way people can easily withstand that kind of volatility is if they have sufficient liquid financial assets, and they don't. So we document that to withstand the kind of volatility that we observe, you need $4,800. The middle income quintile person would need $4,800 of financial liquid assets. They don't have them. They have at best $3,000. So I think there is a broader issue around the ways in which this innovative, wonderful aspects of what capitalism is doing. And let's not forget that some of those things are really wonderful. The products we have, the way we live, et cetera, are giving rise to a very high level of instability that delivers very high levels of anxiety. So that would be another part of my suite of things that we might do to improve.
Well, actually, Tyler, you first, then me.
Okay. I just want to say, I think immigration is an absolutely central issue here. I'm very pro-immigration. I would gladly have more across all levels of skills. But the percentage of foreign-born is higher in this country than it's been in a long time. And that means a few things. It means there will be people at lower incomes who are not earning as much as we would like, or have the healthcare coverage or the educational outcomes. I'm not saying that isn't a problem. But when you compare it to where those individuals came from, and you ask the question, What's the best way to make sure the stream of immigrants can keep on coming going forward? That's a very different question than how can we immediately bring those people up to American middle class standards? And I think it's a better question. How do we keep the stream of immigration coming? And if you look at real income mobility, if you could actually compare what those individuals earn here compared to what they earned in their home countries, I suspect it's the case that income mobility in the United States today is either the highest it's ever been or maybe the highest since the 1920s. So we measure mobility in funny ways. We don't fully count the mobility gains of taking in immigrants, but that's going to mean in some ways a frayed social safety net. And the European solution to try to cover everyone as much as you can as quickly as possible, I think it's counterproductive.
That was lovely. That was lovely and slippery. But I want to just raise the issue, which I think Diana talked about.
Deanna, if we're going to be pretty precise about it.
Pardon? Deanna. Sorry about that. Basically, you said people are more worried about the volatility of their incomes now. There's the middle class is more worried about the volatility of their incomes than the notion of the fact their incomes are on average stagnant.
Well, yeah, my point is that the anxiety we are talking about that gives rise to a question like this is not limited to what the people who are making minimum wage are, whether we set it at $7.50 or we set it at 10 or for that matter 15. Those people are not squarely in the middle class. In the middle class, we're talking about people who are making up to $60,000. And those people, I'm saying, we observe are experiencing very high levels of volatility. They don't have a buffer to withstand it. And that is, cause for anxiety.
But now the implications of that, this sounds to me like, does anybody have a solution to this one? Even remotely close to a solution to this one, if we accept the notion that volatility is higher than is very high now. The sort of the gig economy is coming at you all. What in the world could we do about this without major changes in market capitalism? Alan?
Well, I think we need to modernize our unemployment insurance system. So the most direct solution is wage loss insurance, where you make up part of the loss in earnings for workers for some period of time, which we have as part of trade adjustment assistance and appears to have worked rather well. For workers in the gig economy who are not covered by unemployment insurance, it's a much more difficult problem. And I think there we should think about some form of savings account, some rainy day fund which they're encouraged to develop. Because as you mentioned earlier, workers are more and more responsible for their own safety net. And we don't do a good enough job preparing the population to build their safety net. And to the extent we do, it's through a lot of tax incentives at work to encourage companies to opt workers into savings accounts, and that's all fine. But that's not helping the very quickly growing sector of workers who are not in a traditional employment relationship.
I have this feeling John was gnashing his teeth a bit. Was I wrong there?
Volatility?
Pardon?
Volatility? So I'm not sure what you mean by volatility. I mean, is that the big Great Recession and a lot of people got laid off? Is it because there's people moving through the income distribution more? Is it because growth is low? To me, the problem is low growth, low labor force participation, lack of opportunities for lots of people. It's not really volatility. So, I mean, you can think of it in different ways. Of course, we have a dynamic society, and people change their jobs 10 times or whatever, labor economists find. But to me, our growth is very low. Labor force participation is very low. Income growth is very low. And that's what we should be addressing. That's, to me, the fundamentals. I'd say, going back briefly to the minimum wage, Alan's work is important. But, Alan, there's so many other studies who question, and there's a huge debate. So I tell my students here, read Card and Kruger, but read all these other people too. And so this is one of those things in economics. There are lots of different views. CBO got 500,000 job loss, not from 12, from I think it was 11.
Yeah, but none at 9. And the CBO also had 22 million people getting a raise. So
yes, that's great for those people. What about the 500,000 people who lose their job or don't get a job?
All right, I'm going to cut this off because it's going to get. We're going to get back into we're going to get into the weeds here. Want to go into an issue of competitiveness, and I don't mean competitiveness with China or Germany. I mean competition, market competition in the United States. There is certainly a sense out there that there is less of it. That somehow this might be related to increasing industrial concentration, to intervention, to political intervention in markets, to big money politics. You guys want to comment on this? Tyler, you probably have the oddest opinion here. So
concentration indices have gone up as best we can measure them. I think we're not quite sure how potential competition has fared. But if I look at what are actually the biggest competitive problems, they tend to have a lot to do with the government. It's the healthcare sector. It's hospital consolidation. It's your cable company. People hate their cable companies. Those are highly regulated sectors. We could, in some cases, regulate them less, or in a lot of other cases, regulate them better. So I don't think there's a general dysfunction. A lot of the private monopolies we have, such as Google, they're giving something away for free. It's a highly contestable market. One click gets you to Bing or anywhere else you want to go. So I think the real problem there is a lot of bad regulation, which is ossifying and getting worse, and we're not doing enough for regulation to keep pace with the times. And that's something which, in general, regulation is very bad at, and we need to keep in mind when we pass new regulations that it will be hard to improve them as times and technologies change.
who wants to respond to that?
I pretty much agree with what Tyler said. That there's a role of government in encouraging some of this concentration. I guess I would add, to some extent, the financial sector and at least the remnants of support and too big to fail, which are there. Because that definitely, to the extent it's there, encourages concentration. There's debates about whether it has occurred, but that's a concern to me. I would like to see a change in regulation where we reform the bankruptcy code. It's a proposal, Chapter 14, which we've been working on, which would allow a large financial firm to go through bankruptcy without causing havoc in the economy. I think that would improve the role of government substantially. And it also would be something that would be more consistent with the laws that exist. The firms are required to submit these living wills, and they get rejected constantly by the regulators because they can't write down a way they'll use the living will without further government support. So I think that may be a minutia, but it's a specific law, a proposal we could get going, low-hanging fruit.
Alan, you want to?
I'll let Deanna respond on the resolution authority in Dodd-Frank, which I think is a major step forward compared to where we were with Lehman Brothers in 2008. But one area where I am in agreement, I think, probably with John and Tyler, is occupational licensing has run amok. And that's regulations that affect 25–30% of the workforce. And you need a license in most states to work at a beauty parlor and wash somebody's hair. You know, I wash my hair every morning without a license, and I haven't really screwed up yet. It's really gotten carried away, and it's in part a way for the state governments, because it's state policy, not federal by and large, to raise fees, and has led to a lot of rent seeking, and it's made it difficult, I think, for people to move up in the income distribution. So that's one area where I think we could do a lot more, just by having reciprocity. If you're a spouse of a member of the military who moves every 3 or 4 years, and typically the spouse is a woman, and the most common job is nurse and then teacher, you have to get certified in each new state where you moved. You need to pay a fee and take licensing requirements. Sometimes you have to apprentice for a while, and then you move again. So at a minimum, we should have states accept teachers and nurses who were licensed in another state as well as other professions.
So I would add, for 10 years, when I ran almost 10 years, when I ran the McKinsey Global Institute, we did extensive work on productivity. Micro sector level comparisons, you know, across countries, within countries, across companies. And I would say, by and large, the single most important factor driving what explained the differences in productivity were sector level regulations. And it was product market, it was licensing, it was land use, all these things that are, you know, very frustrating to people because they want the silver bullet. What's the answer? What's the answer? And it's just, you got to get in there and you got to get complicated. It's in the details. And so I do think that there's a lot that needs to be done to continue to evolve regulations and work them. I think we're in a terrible situation as it relates to doing that well. And unfortunately, the rhetoric that it's crippling regulation that is the problem to productivity, I take huge issue with that, because I think it belies what regulation is really about, which is society should not allow anybody to do what they want. We need a give and take where we use market mechanisms to achieve outcomes, but where we put in certain layers of concerns around environment, around worker safety, around any number of things that we define as a society. And the process of regulation is to help figure out what the ideal cost benefit between what we want as society and what markets will do unfettered in one way or another, and that's the regulatory process. And we should celebrate the regulatory process when it works and not vilify it all the time, because it's necessary to a well-working society. We run a danger of having that regulatory process captive to industry, and when industry gets too powerful, or where we get to the earlier conversation, sort of extractive politics of people controlling through campaigns or otherwise that process, then we lose the ways in which society can define itself through that. On the other hand, we also have this equivalent problem of populism that creates a negation of any possibility of regulatory bodies engaging seriously with industry around how do we achieve our desired goals at the least possible cost. And if you look now, Dodd-Frank is the thing I was closest to, because I was in the White House when we were driving that, and very actively, the ability for the regulators today to work on these very complicated issues and to fix the things about Dodd-Frank that don't work is almost incapacitated entirely, because any discussion with industry becomes a captive discussion, becomes and that's a terrible problem. So I think we have both problems of becoming too captive because it's controlled by large industry, or not allowing the discussion that is necessary between regulators and industry to achieve societal outcomes at the best cost-benefit equation possible. But I think that this rhetoric of, it's all about regulation. I mean, imagine a society without regulation. It's not one I want to live in. I mean, I could take you places there. And so I'd like to introduce a slightly more sophisticated way of how do we make that regulatory process work, and sometimes it works very well.
Fair enough. Guys, you've all been very patient, and I would like to leave a few minutes for questions. And we only got 6 left, so I think we have the capacity for questions here. Does somebody have a microphone? Folks, I can't see anything, but is...
I see a hand up in the middle.
The answer is no. Well, that's a pity. Because here's the trouble, guys. If you ask a question, we won't. It'll just go blank. Actually, I can repeat the question. Go ahead. Let's do it that way. We got.
Talk about current period income inequality. I'm interested in, especially with John living in California, intergenerational inequality and the liabilities that are being pushed onto my kids in the next generation.
Yeah.
Specifically in California, AB 1469 is going to double teacher pension contributions for the next 30 years. That's paying for past promises.
Yeah, that's a pretty tough question to summarize. The question was to John. Can you?
I think it's the future of intergenerational mobility and the overhang of promises in governments, local governments in particular, about pensions, how that's going to influence it. There is definitely an overhang, which is now, to me, it's another problem we have. We're squeezing out services. Actually, the federal government, too. We're squeezing out infrastructure spending. We're squeezing out military, for that matter, because of this growing entitlements. It's very similar to local governments in California in particular. I think, though, that what's most interesting me about intergenerational mobility are these studies. Some of us referred to Raj Chetty already, which shows an enormous difference in the states. In fact, in areas within the states. Where I live, Santa Clara County, it is the most upwardly mobile county, maybe exception of Salt Lake City County in the country. And we want to understand why that's the case. Part of it is education, part of it is Silicon Valley, part of it is there's quite a geographical distribution of where people live, and it's twice as high, or whatever the number is, compared to Oakland across the bay. So I think we're going to learn a lot from that. Some people saying we should try to move people around. I think it's really, you change the services you're providing. That's why I come back to education again.
Okay. Hard to know who I'm pointing at. Okay, we'll try down here.
3 questions.
Please.
Go ahead.
To foreigners, it looks very much like America's dream is broken, and for 20 years there's been no growth for anyone other than the top 1%. I don't think the panel's answered the question. Capitalism is broken in this country.
That was a comment, but it was the comment was, for those who didn't hear it, that the growth is taking place entirely at the top in terms of incomes, and by that definition, capitalism is broken. Anybody want to comment on that?
So just quickly, I think it's not broken by any means. Like, don't forget, I mentioned that same span of time, 1 billion people come out of poverty through capitalism. So we have all sorts of information. I think what I look at is in the U.S. in these years, our environment for capitalism is being adverse. We're doing lots of things that are counter to capitalism. And we heard somebody at this panel already. Tyler mentioned some. We all mentioned some of the things that are holding it back. I think that's what we need to address.
The last 20 years have seen a weird mix of a rising China and slower than normal productivity growth. You have to ask yourself, are those temporary or permanent? I say they're both temporary. So I'm not an extreme pessimist looking forward, though I think it will never be the world of all incomes going up 3% a year the way we might have hoped for in 1966.
Can I add, it's more than the last 20 years. It's the last 35 years. Bottom did miserably in the 1980s. The only period where the bottom saw growth was from the mid-90s to the late 90s, when the economy was growing very strong and we had a high-pressure labor market. I think we need to make some changes to make sure that growth is more widely shared, and I think we need to make some changes to make sure that we have more growth. Capitalism, however, has produced tremendous progress worldwide. So we want to be careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, of course. But I think we've had some serious problems, which I think we're seeing. And I agree with everything Tyler said about immigration. The only problem is the rest of the country doesn't agree with us.
Sure.
Even Marco Rubio, who led the charge within the Senate, backed away from his own bill. And we have this vision of ourselves as a nation of immigrants, but we're actually way behind Canada and Europe. 12% of Americans today are foreign-born. Canada, it's 21%. We've had a net out-migration over the last 5 years, especially with Mexico. So I think that the rise in inequality that we've seen has prevented us from taking some of the actions that could lead to better economic policy and a bigger pie for the economy.
We have time for one quick question. Please.
It seems like technology is replacing jobs in a different way. Driverless cars have come to replace all the trucking drivers. Orders are getting replaced by automatic systems. Is it different? Is it going to be a big change?
This is a question about basically whether finally, to paraphrase, whether automation is going to cut deeply into actual job opportunities. Anybody have a quick answer?
I would say it always has. It always has. Agriculture to manufacturing to et cetera. But there's probably something important about the pace of change now. And that's a well-known feature. But we do see so many more areas being affected at a much more rapid pace. That it raises new questions, but I think this phenomenon we've seen for the last 50 years.
And may I say there's a whole panel on this coming up.
2:30.
2:30 this afternoon.
Palm room.
Thank you all. I appreciate your coming. And thanks to the panel.
John.
Thank you.